So this is the second part of the background, the kind of historical context to the partition of India and Pakistan. Remember, I've broken what is really quite a monster lecture in normal times down into 3 sections. This is part 2. And in this set of slides, we're going to talk about the end of the empire in India. So in the first set of slides, I talked about the consolidation, first of the East India Company in India, and then of the empire proper, when the government of Great Britain oversaw the empire in India directly. We also talked about some of the colonial context of India, and we talked about some of the origins of Indian anti-colonial nationalist movements and Indian intellectual movements. In this section, we're moving into the 20th century specifically, and we're going to talk about the relationship between the Muslim League and the Congress Party. Remember, I talked about the founding of the Congress Party in 1885. I'm going to talk about the corollary political party, the Muslim League, which was representative of a subsection of the Indian Muslim population. So they painted the Congress Party as being for Hindus primarily, and that they were more representative of the Muslims. The Muslim League was one of the kind of 2 key parties involved in the partition of India and Pakistan in 1947. A lot of this history really kicks off, and it starts to take on a lot of complexity and a lot of speed and a lot of kind of difficulty after the First and Second World War. So I'm going to talk specifically about the kind of last years of the empire, really from about 1940 to 1947. And then finally, we're going to take a step back and think about boundary making in this context, and think about how 20th century theories of boundary making created by primarily white geographers in places like the United States, Great Britain, and France get used to shore up or to facilitate what eventually becomes the partition of India and Pakistan. So just a reminder, in the previous set of slides, one of the things I really emphasized was how after the East India Company had kind of so-called conquered, right? They use this language, I'm using it ironically and with scare quotes if you can see me. After they consolidate their territory, what they start to do is consolidate their rule and their government. And they do this primarily through the study and measurement of the land and of the people. And so census taking exercises become central to how colonial officials govern and make policy and make decisions and exercise control. The first kind of relatively successful, and I say relatively successful because I mean within reason, the first successful censuses in India take place in the 1880s. There are censuses that happen earlier, but really the kind of 1880 census is kind of the most important for our terms and our purposes. And one key aspect of the census was spatial representation of the population as it was distributed over territory. So if you think about Foucault, remember he was talking about putting bodies into discrete spaces, putting bodies into cells, putting bodies into hospital beds. If you're a student, right, putting student bodies into individual desks so a teacher can locate a particular student at any given time. And this happens on the level of the group or the category in India based on what the government determined to be salient political identities. So remember, we talked about Hindus versus Muslims versus Sikhs. We also talked about how the government was really interested in counting tribal groups and caste groups. Caste is extremely important to the British mind in India. And the whole point of this kind of spatial distribution was so that the government could look at a map, a colonial official could look at a map and see roughly where in India a dominant population was located. This is really important when it comes time to partition the territory based specifically on salient political identities. So this image comes from the Imperial Gazetteer of India from 1909, right? Partition happens in 1947. This map comes from 1909. And this represents a colonial vision of the subject territory and population. This isn't necessarily a kind of single or wholly accurate representation of India. This is a snapshot of the India that the British government wanted to know and understand. There are any number of ways that one could map the population of India. Religion was considered to be really important, specifically by the government. So they isolated it and they mapped it, and then they shared this information publicly. It's important to remember, though, that was a really statist, top-down representation or vision of the territory, but there are alternatives. We can use maps and we can use data and quantification as a form of resistance. And so it's interesting how alternatives to that kind of state-driven representation of India became more difficult to imagine the further along we go. So the guy who came up with the name Pakistan is a guy named Chaudhry Rahmat Ali. And he came up with Pakistan as a term to describe the new independent nation state that he believed should be made out of a piece of territory in the Indian subcontinent. He lived in Cambridge. He actually spent the majority of his adult life in Cambridge. He was a very well-educated Indian Muslim nationalist thinker. He died in Cambridge and he is still buried there, interestingly enough. And Pakistan is an acronym, and it's an acronym that refers to the dominant core regions of the territory that he believed belonged in Pakistan, in this Indian Muslim nation. It refers to the Punjab, the Afghan region, which refers to the Northwest Frontier Province now, Kashmir, Indus, the Indus Valley, Sindh, and Stan means land, but it's also referring to Baluchistan. And it's really interesting that Chaudhry Rahmat Ali came up with an alternative cartographic vision of India to rival the kind of British statist approach to India, which was really about predominant religious categories. But here he's talking about a more pluralistic society. Eventually, this way of thinking about the map of India becomes really marginalized. So after independence, it gets reappropriated by Pakistani nationalists who are working to shore up a kind of Pakistani nationalism. But in the 1930s, when this concept was first put forward, it was not popular at all. The idea of Pakistan only really becomes popular just before independence. So it only becomes common usage by the Muslim League in 1940. And the term itself, Pakistan, really only becomes kind of a usable or effective political term after 1940, and really not until 1945. So at this point, there are a number of organized nationalist parties, and they have quite a bit of power within the government. So India was governed by a very complex system, and it was changed at various points over the years as the British government responded to kind of nationalist agitation and negotiation. So this is where the story gets quite complicated. So these multiple organized nationalist parties exercise quite a bit of power within the government. They're run by a group of very well-educated, extremely intelligent, intellectual men, most of whom are lawyers or judges. It's interesting that nationalists in India tended to come out of the legal profession. There's a very interesting pattern there. These three men, Nehru becomes the Prime Minister of India after independence. Muhammad Ali Jinnah becomes the Prime Minister of Pakistan after independence, and he was the leader of the Muslim League. And Gandhi, Mohandas Gandhi, maintains a kind of father-like figure at the head of the Congress Party. Gandhi's power in Congress has waned by 1947. He's actually more of a kind of spiritual leader. He's a sort of grandfatherly figure. But he is not running the Congress Party in the way that he was a few decades prior. So the Congress had historically held the most power, relatively speaking, through the 20s and 30s. And this is when Gandhi's nonviolence movement really takes off. So he founds his nonviolence movement, and it was designed specifically to boycott British rule. And in the 1930s, the Muslim League is taken over by this guy named Muhammad Ali Jinnah. The League had kind of fallen into disrepair a little bit. It had kind of fallen apart, and it wasn't a particularly effective political party by the 1930s. Interestingly, Jinnah had actually been a member of the Congress Party, but he resigned his role in Congress, and he self-exiled himself to Britain. So he spent quite a bit of time in the 1920s in Britain. But in the 1930s, as a rhetoric of Hinduism and Hinduism as being the kind of dominant cultural unifier of Indians starts to percolate within Congress discourse, disaffected Muslim politicians in India start to worry that Muslims in India will be left out of a negotiation of independent India. And so they start to organize, and they invite Jinnah back to head the Muslim League and to try and rehabilitate a Muslim nationalist movement in India. And originally, and for most of his tenure as president of the Muslim League, Jinnah did not want an independent Pakistan, and this is really important. At the end of World War II, in 1939, the Congress leadership leads a boycott of the Second World War. So, I'm going to go back. So, throughout World War II, the Congress leadership leads a boycott of the Second World War. They say, during the First World War, our soldiers fought in Europe and fought in the East on your behalf. We made weapons and equipment, and we sent food from our farms in the Punjab to Europe. We're not going to do that. We're going to boycott the war effort. And as a result of this, the Congress Party leadership is imprisoned until 1945. So from 1939 until 1945, all of the key players in the Congress Party, and these are the people who are leading the anti-national or anti-colonial nationalist movement for an independent India, are in prison. And this leaves the Muslim League to start to build up a power base. So, by 1945, when the Congress leaders are released from prison, the Muslim League now represents a credible and quite powerful alternative to Congress. After the war, the leadership is released. The British are under international pressure to give India independence, right? The Americans don't like any empire that isn't their own, so the American government and the American people are advocating on behalf of Gandhi. They're quite smitten with his nonviolence movement. They find it quite meaningful and inspiring. And so there's international pressure for India to achieve independence. But by this time, the Indian leadership, roughly meaning these guys and the people that worked with them, can't agree on what independent India should look like. So all of the attempts to create an independent India fail. The idea of partition doesn't enter Indian political discourse seriously until 1940. And even then, in 1940, the word Pakistan is not mentioned. So this is the presidential address given by Jinnah to the Muslim League in Lahore in 1940. Basically, the party conferences were kind of like how party conferences happen here and now. So the Labour Party conference happened recently. Whenever the Conservatives have a party conference, right? This is very similar. So at the party conference, Jinnah gives a speech. He gives his presidential address. And this is the first time he mentions some sort of reference to a territorial unit that would specifically be for Indian Muslims. And so I'm going to read this to you because I think it's really important. So he said, the problem in India is not of an intercommunal character. Remember, communal refers to interreligious groups and interreligious conflict, but manifestly of an international one, and it must be treated as such. So basically he's saying that Muslims and Hindus aren't communal groups, they're nations. So long as this basic and fundamental truth is not realized, any constitution that may be built will result in disaster and will prove destructive and harmful not only to the Muslimans, but to the British and Hindus also. If the British government are really in earnest and sincere to secure the peace and happiness of the people of this subcontinent, the only course open to us all is to allow the major nations separate homelands by dividing India into autonomous national states. That's all he says. He doesn't go on about Pakistan, he doesn't say partition, and he doesn't rule out the possibility either of a loose federation. Now, Aisha Jalal, a very famous South Asian studies scholar and historian based in the United States, argues that actually, because this is an extremely vague representation of territoriality, she argues that this does not represent Jinnah actually saying that the Muslims should have a completely independent sovereign nation state called Pakistan. What he was saying is actually that they should use Pakistan and partition as a bargaining chip. So she says that Jinnah may very well have wanted diffuse power and decentralized Indian power with provinces that were run by majority governments, for example. He didn't want an independent Pakistan. She believes, and I think she's absolutely correct, her evidence is excellent, that the idea of Pakistan was a bargaining chip that Jinnah planned to play because he believed that the Congress Party wouldn't possibly agree to it. So it was a bit of a bluff. There were a number of different attempts to create a workable solution to transfer power to the new Indian government. They all failed. So the British government sends in a notorious fixer, Lord Louis Mountbatten. You can see him there. You may or may not recognize him. They send him to India in February of 1947 with the remit to get the job done. And the original plan when he arrives is that he'll grant independence to India in 1948. But after a number of meetings with the leadership, he decides that this has to happen sooner. So he sets up boundary commissions, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And he says we're going to do it on a really quick timeline. India's going to be granted independence by August 1947. So he arrives in February, and by August he says India's going to be independent. The Congress Party calls the Muslim League's bluff on Pakistan. It's the Congress Party in the end that refuses to accept a plan, which the Muslim League does agree to, that would allow India to construct itself as a sort of a loose decentralized federation of large powerful states. So it would look a little bit like the United States. Congress says no, they don't want that. They would rather have partition. So they call Jinnah's bluff and they push partition through. And on the 3rd of June, Mountbatten and the nationalist leaders announce via All India Radio that India will be given independence by August, that India will be partitioned along Muslim and non-Muslim lines. That's really important. So if you go back and look at the 1909 map, you'll see a cartographic precedent for that Muslim, non-Muslim line. And it will all be wrapped up. Here we go. This is the map. So recall, in the east, hope you can see my cursor. In the east, Bengal, here, and in the west, Punjab, Kashmir, Northwest Frontier Province, Balochistan, and Sindh here. These are Muslim majority areas. They're shown in green. The Hindu majority areas are shown in purple. This is roughly what Pakistan and India look like after independence is granted in 1947. Really importantly, recall, this is an enormous, massive territory. And when Pakistan is granted independence, it gains independence as two completely separate, contiguous territorial units. This is very important. So, Mountbatten creates boundary commissions. So if you recall from our materials on the U.S.-Mexico border, a boundary commission was set up after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo to survey and then create a boundary along the U.S.-Mexico border. Boundary commissions also get created in this context. And it's really quite interesting, actually, because the phrasing of the remit of the boundary commissions becomes really important for how the partition process actually plays out. So this is the official remit for the Boundary Commission. So the government said this is how the Boundary Commissions are going to operate. The Boundary Commission is instructed to demarcate the boundaries of the two parts of the Punjab on the basis of ascertaining the contiguous majority areas of Muslims and non-Muslims. In doing so, it will also take into account other factors. They also created a boundary commission for Bengal, and the remit was the same, except that they say that the boundary commission is instructed to demarcate the boundaries of the two parts of Bengal on the basis of ascertaining the contiguous majority areas, right? Remember, boundary making has taken on a kind of set of standard practices. And remember when we talked about the U.S.-Mexico border and this word, demarcation. What does demarcation mean? Does it mean running around on the ground, putting stakes and fences and monuments into the ground? Yes. Does it mean sitting at a map and drawing a boundary on a map and then signing a treaty? No. That word is, I can hear you saying it, delineate, right? So even in this context, the Boundary Commission is set up with a very minimal, I would argue like non-existent understanding of how boundaries are actually made. This has catastrophic consequences. Here we go. Remember, delimitation, demarcation, and maintenance. Demarcation is running around on the boundary, sticking spikes in the ground. Meanwhile, boundary making has really taken on a very standardized practice. So boundary making is understood by scholars and statesmen and diplomats and practitioners as a kind of universal process that is made up of a number of procedures that can be applied in any context. So boundary making is roughly framed around this concept of what makes a good border. We also see a kind of interesting separation between physical and human geography take place here. So we move away from thinking of boundaries as being physical boundaries. So in the 19th century, remember we talked about how physical boundaries are really important. Hence the Rio Grande River along the U.S.-Mexico border. By the 20th century, there's a greater emphasis on homogeneous populations. So it becomes more important to boundary makers that a population be homogeneous based on some identity category. There's also a greater and growing relationship between geography and the nation state. So the boundary needs to map as closely as possible onto not just the kind of territorial and political limits of the nation state, but also onto the cultural and identity limits of the nation state. So the goal here is that all the Hindus will live within a particular set of territory bounded by borders that are very clearly marked on the map, and no one else will live there. That's the ultimate goal. It sounds nonsensical because it is, right? The world doesn't actually look like that. So this ends up causing quite a lot of problems. Here's a similar map. This is the Boundary Commission map of Ulster from 1921. A similar type of partition, actually. The similarities between Ireland and India are really important. What's really interesting about this process is one of the kind of key, I wouldn't call him a thinker necessarily. He was a colonial official and he was absolutely an apologist for empire. His name was Thomas Holditch, and he was an engineer and geographer for the military. He was involved in like the Durand Line, for example, drawing the boundary between Afghanistan and Pakistan. He wrote a bunch of books in his retirement. So he left the forces, and then he went home, got into his garden shed, and wrote a bunch of books on his experience of boundary making and in political frontiers. So he writes his book, 1916. And in this book, he says this really fascinating thing. He says, "It is not for high personages sitting in solemn political conclave to decide on evidence which is always contradictory and uncertain, what the people, whether nomads of the Asiatic steppes, tribesmen on the African plains, settlers on a disputed American frontier, French patriots, or German apostles of culture, may consider to be the fulfillment of their desires on a matter which means life or death to them, whilst it is only a question of political exigency and bargain to the government concerned." Despite the kind of paternalistic colonial rhetoric here about the peoples of the empire, he's absolutely right. And he's saying something really interesting about democracy here, which is that it shouldn't be for, high-powered elite judges and lawyers to sit around a table and decide about the fates of, millions of people. He says it's really important that the process involve the people for whom the nation state will exist. But of course, this isn't what happens in partition. Partition is absolutely enacted by high personages sitting in solemn political conclave, right? Remember Mountbatten and the elite political leaders of the Congress Party and the Muslim League. So here he is. Mountbatten is in charge of the whole process, but he wants to seem like he's remaining politically neutral. So he appoints a judge, a guy named Cyril Radcliffe, to be the chairman of the Boundary Commissions and to be the final arbiter on the drawing of the eventual line. He is absolutely the epitome of a personage in a high place. The standard story about him goes, he was a venerable judge by the time he gets asked to do this. He is a bit of a fixer for the colonial government. He's a bit like Mountbatten in that he's been sent around to different contexts in order to adjudicate on really tense and high-profile issues around the empire. He's never been to India before in 1947. He knows absolutely nothing about it. And one of the key things that historians always come back to about Radcliffe is that he had never, ever drawn a boundary before. So this, according to the standard narrative, the kind of standard historiographical narrative, is evidence that the geography here was done terribly, and that because the geography was done so badly, that is what led to the eventual violence that happens after partition. But actually, as we'll see, the geography here is more complex. This is my own research, by the way. So what I'm giving you here is like a taster of my eventual book when it comes out. Hopefully 2025 or something like that. But this is my stuff. So that's why I'm going on and on about it. So you may or may not remember, perhaps I showed this to you in Nature of Geographical Knowledge or, in any other course that I've taught you. This is David Livingstone's quote from his book, Putting Science in its Place. Livingstone's a professor of geography, not the Livingstone that goes to Africa and colonizes Africa in the 19th century. Different Livingstone. Professor Livingston has written extensively about the sites in which science gets done. So he's really interested in scientific inquiry and practice as taking place in particular spaces, and that those spaces actually help construct and shape the scientific inquiry itself. So he's talking about the laboratory, the hospital, the museum, the observatory, the zoo, the botanical garden. These are all spaces that are designated for scientific discovery and experimentation. And he argues that science is influenced by these spaces, that they're physically and socially constructed in ways that determine the trajectory of the scientific inquiry. So he says this: the disposition of equipment and other accoutrements regulates human behavior in one way or another. Frequently, the site is constructed so as to restrain or promote certain social interactions, right? So if you leave ladies out, then you don't have ladies and men intermixing, right? So that those social interactions are avoided, because we can't have those. In some cases, entry is carefully controlled by formal mechanisms of boundary maintenance, right? Can't let poor people in because poor people don't know how to do science, right? If they did, God would have given them money, et cetera, right? All this kind of Victorian ideology. So he goes on to say that here, in these spaces of science, decisions are settled about what passes as scientific knowledge, how it should be acquired, and the means by which claims are warranted. In these venues, practitioners absorb the core values, convictions, and conventions of their tradition of inquiry. Right, this is key here. So the variety of venues available for science in British India was extensive, and they existed across multiple scales. So, for example, we've talked about Matthew Edney quite a bit, and when he writes about the Great Trigonometric Survey, which gets undertaken across the Indian landscape and which utilizes pre-existing local sites of sacred and political significance as trig points, which is really key. The GTS fashions the entirety of the subcontinent's territory as a laboratory for developing more accurate and efficient methods of surveying and mapping. Right, so one of the things we talked about in NOGK is actually they trial surveying techniques in India and then bring it back and found the Ordnance Survey in Britain, right? So there's also the development of universities and zoos and government research departments in India, which lead to the establishment of designated Indian laboratories. And this also facilitates to a great extent the entry of Indians into the social world of scientific practice. So there are lots of Indian scientists in universities and in government research centers, right? There are thriving Indian universities with Indian academics and Indian students. Geography, of course, at this time fashioned itself as a science, and there wasn't a significant challenge to that assumption until the latter decades of the 20th century, right? You've learned all about that. And so geography operated within certain scientific venues. By the turn of the century, geography largely became the science of territorial organization and administration. So for the most part, geographers had been put to work in India for the purposes of boundary making and map making exercises in the service of the colonial government. And geography, like most scientific practice, was made subservient to the political whims of the government. So if this is the kind of standard practicing of geography in the mid-20th century when partition comes to be, what happens to geography when it moves out of its regular venues, like the field? So the venues for partition, which was very much a legal and judicial process, had very little to do with the equipment and other accoutrements of the surveying party's adventures in the mountains or the survey offices in Calcutta. So it's really interesting, right? A lot of historians say geographers should have been involved. Geography should have been key to the process. If you're drawing a boundary, you need to have geographical experts. But geographers are fundamentally at this time working for the government, and they're trying to maintain colonial power. They're not really that interested or used to, or, it's not really part of their remit to help a colonized people achieve independence. This is not really what geographers do. It might be now, but it certainly wasn't in 1947. And finally, the last problem here with geography is slow and methodical. So if you remember the US-Mexico border and the boundary commissions there, it took them decades to finish. But this process took 6 weeks from start to finish. There was no surveying, no map making, no measurement. They relied solely on previously collected data. And spoiler alert, that data was not always accurate. All right, so this is the story. To recap, the general story that historians tell about partition. One of the reasons it failed so badly is because of the geography. There was no geography and no geographers involved. If geographical experts had been involved and experts in mapmaking had been involved, partition wouldn't have been so violent. The terms of reference use geography badly and incorrectly. There's no concern for the practice of boundary making or the practice of geography at all. And all of this leads to the eventual violence that accompanies partition in 1947. I am going to, in the next set of slides, unpack those assumptions and challenge them. All right, and that will be part 3 of our massive set of slides on the partition of India and Pakistan.